It is time for the Big Three. Today's topics: no big deal, burning questions, and this week's must-read. So let's bring in my Big Three panel. Acting politics editor for Call Shira Toeplitz, MSNBC contributor and former chief economic policy advisor to Vice President Biden, Jared Bernstein, and MSNBC contributor and former Bush Cheney senior advisor, Robert Traynham, also a Georgetown University dean. Hello to the three of you. Thank you for joining us. Jared, I'm going to begin with you here because it doesn't seem like Congress has a sense of urgency on this sequester. Is that for a valid reason, because its impact will slowly unravel, or is that kind of false and dangerous thinking?
It's more false and dangerous thinking than validity, and I very much agree with you vis-a-vis the lack of urgency. I think if most Americans really understood what's at stake here, they would be scratching their heads as to why Congress isn't more worried. We're talking about if the sequester takes effect and holds, 70,000 kids losing their Head Start slots, 14,000 teachers for those kinds of programs laid off, 30,000 kids losing child care assistance. Now, a lot of people might be thinking, okay, that's bad, but that doesn't really affect me. Well, if you travel, you're going to encounter longer lines because Homeland Security is going to have to furlough workers. Air traffic control is going to have to lay people off. That means some small airports will probably close. I mean, this is a big deal. Most of us think that if these kinds of things take effect, perhaps there will be enough pressure for Congress to come back to the table and negotiate this. But one thing this economy doesn't need right now is another, kind of kick in the shins like this.
But you're talking about Congress coming back and negotiating. I don't know, not so much maybe. Robert, let's take a listen to Paul Ryan and Juan Castro. They're talking about who's to blame. Here's this.
It's the president who proposed this sequester. It's the president who designed this sequester. It's the House Republicans who twice passed legislation replacing the sequester with smarter cuts in other areas of government.
The fact is, this was never the president's idea. This was the result of hostage politics engaged in by a Tea Party-controlled Republican Party, and this is what you have. This is the mess that you have when you get into those kind of hostage politics.
Should have said Joaquin Castro there. But anyway, who's right there?
I think they're both kind of right, but let's just put this in context. The president, the administration agreed to the sequester at the end of the day. You can make the argument that perhaps maybe some hard white Republicans forced the Democrats' hand here, but look, at the end of the day, the Democrats agreed to this a year and a half ago. But let me go back for a second here. I agree with Jared that there are major economic and political consequences if, in fact, a sequester does go through. But I have a sneaky suspicion, Alex, that staff as well as members are working behind the scenes for that not to happen. I think this laissez-faire approach that we see on the surface is just a facade. I really do think that the Congress will come together and actually get something done because the political ramifications and the economic ramifications, particularly from the Republican perspective, is that high.
Okay, I'm going to ask the journalist here, Shira, what do you think? I mean, do you think stuff is going on behind the scenes? Because otherwise it looks like we've got 4 days once Congress gets back next Monday, a week from tomorrow, ahead of that Friday deadline. Do you think a deal will be reached? Are you hearing anything about behind the scenes?
Well, I do think there are Hill aides right now working on a package. Obviously, Senate Democrats proposed something last week. So there are people looking at this problem and trying to find a solution. That said, because of congressional recess and the deadline approaching so quickly, I don't think it'll happen by March 1st. I think we are looking more towards the end of March. We're going to see some of these cuts begin to take effect. It won't be exactly like what the fiscal cliff would have been because it's an issue of resources drying up and contracts not being renewed, that sort of thing. It's a very different process. It's a very different kind of cut. So Congress really has a month of wiggle room to figure something out, and I'm pretty optimistic they'll come up with some package to stave off some of these cuts as part of a larger fiscal deal by the end of March, when there's another looming deadline, when the continuing resolution to fund the government ends.
Jared, month of wiggle room?
Yeah, if I might say, I mean, I like Robert's optimism, but I'm afraid Shira is probably closer to what might happen here if we're lucky, because, what you call a month of wiggle room is a month of all those cuts that I just articulated taking effect. And again, we have an economy that's already kind of slogging along at a growth rate that's much too slow. To hit it with fiscal contraction of that magnitude is really, really bad policy. Let us never forget that these are self-inflicted wounds. It's exactly the opposite of what we'd want our policymakers to be doing right now.
Okay, can I ask you also with regard to this, we all move on to burning questions, Jared, the president calling for this minimum wage hike. How serious is this proposal? How much would this help toward alleviating poverty? Or, as critics suggest, would it just mean cuts in jobs for the small business owners who are going to have to pay more per hour for their employees?
So working backwards, we've had dozens of federal minimum wage increases. We now have 19 states that have their own minimum wages. If it had the kind of job loss or disemployment effects that its critics complain, we definitely would have seen them by now. So there's lots of research to suggest that those effects are minimal and that the benefits outweigh the costs in that regard. Is it a serious proposal? Well, it's got a huge legislative hurdle to get over. Obviously, the Republicans are already saying no. But it's interesting to recall that both Bush presidents signed increases in the minimum wage, both George W. and Herbert Walker. So, Republicans have signed on to this kind of thing. In terms of poverty reduction, it absolutely helps. There are lots of poor people. If you're poor and you're working, you have a low-wage job, and this will help you.
Robert, Senator Marco Rubio is saying that the president's immigration plan, structured as it is, DOA, dead on arrival. Senators McCain, Graham, they're leading the opposition to Chuck Hagel's confirmation as a defense secretary. Do you see how it makes people think the GOP is the party of no these days?
I can see how people would think that, Alex, but let's put this in perspective. I mean, Republicans have to stand for something, and there's a principled behavior, if you will, that says that, you know what, we don't agree with this, so let's try to find some middle ground here. Let's give something, and let's see if the Democrats will give something. I agree. I think that the president's immigration proposal probably is dead on arrival, and I think that's by design. I think he is positioning this so far to the left that Republicans have no choice but to say no, because he doesn't want to give Republicans a political win.
I want to ask you, Shira, of the three items the president proposed in the State of the Union address, which one do you think could become a reality? Is it climate change legislation, minimum wage increase? What about pre-K education?
Well, I look at this by process of elimination, right? I don't think a minimum wage increase has a big chance of passing through a very conservative Republican caucus in the House. So in a pre-K education, I think Republicans in the House are again going to look at that as a deficit increaser, no matter how the president packages it. So climate change, I really think, is the one the president will probably focus on. He's mentioned it both in his inauguration and in State of the Union. It's an important issue, and environmentalists really felt like they got a raw deal in his first term.
Okay, coming up next, the Big Three's must-read recommendations.